So the talk today this is absolutely one of my favorite case studies. It's about a woman who came from a disadvantaged background herself and decided the problem she wanted to solve was about helping disadvantaged kids, and has made a tremendous contribution to that. So one of the best case studies we'll do all semester. So we're standing here by the Barbara Jordan statue here on campus. And because in some ways our case study today is kind of like Barbara Jordan. Barbara Jordan grew up in a kind of disadvantaged neighborhood in Houston, went on to make this amazing contribution as a political leader, as a spokesperson for causes that she believed in very, very strongly. And I guess it's particularly meaningful to me. I mean, we can look at someone like Thomas Jefferson, who came from this privileged background, and he was a very good creative problem solver and made a fantastic contribution. But wow, when you think of someone who came from a tough situation and a lot of racial prejudice, honestly, like Barbara Jordan, wow. And then overcame all that and took this kind of creative position she did. Whoa, that's super impressive. So the woman we're talking about today is Michelle Robinson. And she grew up in a very poor neighborhood on the south side of Chicago. You know, it was a mixed neighborhood at the beginning of the time when she was born there, but it pretty quickly was going kind of downhill and became a poorer and poorer neighborhood during the time she lived there as a kid. She had a very stable family. She had two fantastic parents. Her father worked for the city, and he had a good kind of stable blue-collar job. He kept the boilers going in the power plants for the city. But her father had multiple sclerosis, and he was diagnosed with that early in his adult life. So there always was a concern. He had a lot of health expenses, you know, and there was always the possibility that he would not be able to continue to work. So financially, his income was a little insecure. Her mom was an administrative assistant, would have been called a secretary back then. She didn't have a lot of education, but she was a tremendous woman, just can do, get things done, kind of African-American woman. And so she always had a really good and stable job. But they didn't make a lot of money, and they didn't have a lot of financial flexibility, in part because of his illness. And he did, in fact, have to take disability at a fairly young age, and then he passed away at quite a young age as well. So they lived for all of Michelle's childhood in a little two-family house. And it probably was built where the family lived downstairs and there was just a little mother-in-law apartment upstairs. So all it was one bedroom, a little living room, a little kitchen, and one bathroom. But that's where Michelle's family lived, and there were four of them. It might have been built for like one person, but there were four of them in that very, very small apartment. So it was her and her brother and her mom and dad. Her mom and dad were in one bedroom. The living room became her bedroom with her older brother, Craig. And you know, when they were little kids, they just had the beds out there in the room. When they got to be teenagers, her grandfather put up a little partition, so they got a little more modesty, but you know, it was a cramped way to grow up. But it was a loving family, and her whole life, she says, was in this like 5-block radius. So her grandparents lived there, her cousins lived there, their church was there, her elementary school was there. She just really didn't go out that 5-block radius. Now, you know, like many disadvantaged neighborhoods, there was really no grocery store. There was a liquor store, and you could go there and get Wonder Bread and milk and a few rudimentary things, but it was an underserved neighborhood. She lived on a major street called Euclid Avenue. I actually know that neighborhood and know that street. You know, it's right now, it's a rough neighborhood. University of Chicago is not very far away there, but she never even went to the University of Chicago campus. Never saw it, didn't even know it was there hardly. She just stayed in her little small radius. She went to Bryn Mawr Elementary School there, and it was not a very good school. And in fact, there was a write-up in the Chicago newspapers when she was a kid about how it was a slum school, and it was a terrible school. When she was in kindergarten, it was a fairly racially diverse school. There were white kids, there were Asian American kids, there were Hispanic kids, and there were black kids. And it was pretty mixed, like the neighborhood was. But by the 5th grade, it was 100% African American. This was a period of anybody who could get out of that neighborhood got out of that neighborhood. And the people that were left there were the people who were too poor to have many options. And it turned into a totally black school by the time she was in the 5th grade. There was an interesting story about in the 2nd grade, she had a terrible teacher. And it was just mayhem in the classroom. You know, people were throwing erasers and there was just chaos all the time. The teacher had no idea how to control the classroom. It didn't seem like anybody cared in the upper administration of the school. So Michelle is just miserable. She wants to learn something. She's learning nothing. She feels like she feels guilty about the behavior of all her friends here. And, you know, just was terrible for her. And she just kind of couldn't wait. All morning, she just wait for the bell to ring and she could go home and have lunch with her mom and complain about this terrible situation she was in. So kind of unbeknownst to her, her mom started going up to the school and saying, you know, I want Michelle transferred out of that 2nd grade class. This teacher is not a good fit for us. And in fact, over time, she convinced them to move Michelle out of that class and into a class that had a much better teacher who had control over the classroom. Now, that little thing made a huge difference. All the rest of the kids in that class, they like lost a year of their education because they weren't learning anything. And the fact that her mother helped her out and helped her move into this situation where she could get a little better education, whoa, that was huge. So that's the kind of family she was in, that's the kind of neighborhood she was in when she was growing up. So the thing that I'm interested in here with Michelle Robinson is, you know, when you grow up in a situation like that, what kind of values does it embed in you? And, you know, I think it had a huge impact on her, how she was brought up and what the values were in her community. And so all the way through this, we're trying to figure out how is she developing these values and how's that going to impact her ability to solve problems creatively later, and how the values help her figure out what problems she wants to solve. So one really telling thing here is she took piano lessons when she was a little kid. They're living on the 2nd floor. The lady who lives downstairs is her great aunt, and she gives piano lessons on a beat-up old piano in her house. And so Michelle loved taking piano lessons, and she practiced really hard. She was a good piano student. And then one day they were going to have a recital. And the recital was going to be outside the neighborhood, and it was in a really nice recital hall, and it had a really good piano. And she says when she sat down to that piano, she was just totally freaked out. She had never touched anything so perfect and so beautiful. It was all dusted, it was tuned perfectly. It had all this ribbon of black and white sparkling keys. It wasn't beat up. In her world, nothing was perfect. Nothing was high quality. Everything was kind of marginal. And that was her first kind of encounter with something better. And it was a key to sort of see what privilege was like which she had no idea about before. Now, one really big break that Michelle got, I mean, she's going to this not good elementary school and junior high, but she's doing her best. She's a very conscientious student because her parents are encouraging her to do that. And then luckily, just as she began to enter high school, Chicago built a magnet school, Whitney Young High School. And this was going to take kids from all over the city and bring them in and give them a very high quality of education, and much better than Michelle would have been able to get in her neighborhood. So she takes a test to be able to get into the school, and she passes the test. Now there again, if she had not had that change in the second grade where she got the better teacher and she'd lost her second grade year, and then who knows, the third grade might have been the same thing, then she probably couldn't have passed that test. But because her mom made sure that she got at least as good an education as you could at Bryn Mawr, then she was able to pass that test, and she goes to Whitney Young High School. Now, most of the kids there, they got their parents taking them to school or whatever. That couldn't happen in her family. She had to take the bus to and from school. It was an hour and a half on a public bus to get to Whitney Young. She lived on the south side. Whitney Young was kind of on the west side of town. And so she was taking a bus into downtown Chicago and then back out to Whitney Young. And it took an hour and a half. And not only that, but because they were getting on the bus kind of late in its route going downtown, it was always crowded and they couldn't sit. She had a friend who was from the same neighborhood and was also going to Whitney Young. So they were taking an hour and a half bus route and they couldn't sit. Finally, they found a different route where they kind of went out and got an earlier, could get on the bus earlier and get a seat and then come back in. Took a little longer, but they got a seat. But still, it's an hour and a half going to school and it's an hour and a half coming home. Whoa, that's a really, really long day. She gets home 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening, then she has her homework to do. So she's working really, really hard in high school. But she begins to get exposed to new things. Now she's not in her 5-block radius of her neighborhood. Now she's, going on the bus, all these other neighborhoods. She's going downtown. She's seeing people in suits and in high-rise office buildings, and a whole new world opens up to her. And in her high school, there are kids from all over the city. And one of the things that was very surprising to her, she tended to hang out with the other black kids at Whitney Young. But wow, some of these black kids, their moms and dads were lawyers and doctors and were very successful and privileged people. And she didn't even know that existed. And in particular, one of her very best friends was a girl named Santita Jackson. And whoa, and she would go with Santita, home in the afternoon and sometimes spend the night at Santita's house. And so she got to know the Jackson household pretty well. Santita's father was Reverend Jesse Jackson. Reverend Jesse Jackson was one of the biggest leaders of the civil rights movement in the 1960s and 1970s. And just a few years after she and Santita were friends, he ran for president. He was the first black man to run for president of the United States. So she's being exposed to not only people who have a little bit of financial means, but also people who are not just thinking about their own house and their own neighborhood, but people who are thinking about big issues and big ideas and big consequences. And that completely changed the perspective of Michelle Robinson. Now, there was a tough thing about going to Whitney Young. She felt like everybody there was smarter than she was. Everybody there had more privilege, better background. They went to better schools in elementary school and junior high. And she kept thinking, am I good enough to be here? And the answer kept coming back, I don't think so. And it took her a long time to get these incremental small successes and begin to build her confidence a little bit. and begin to think, well, they let me in here. I must be qualified. Maybe I was the best of a bad lot at Bryn Mawr, but I got in here. There was something they saw in me. And she began to really focus on the fact that maybe she was good enough to be there. So then she gets to her senior year, and she's trying to figure out, okay, what's next? And obviously she's college material at this point. And she goes into the counselor to think about what colleges she might want to apply to. And she somehow had gotten into her head she wanted to go to Princeton. And so she talks to the college counselor and says, you know, I'm thinking about Princeton. And the college counselor says, you know, you're doing really well here, Michelle, but I just don't think you're Princeton material. And that really hit Michelle hard. There it was again. Am I good enough here? And that was a blow, but by this point, she said, you know, I'm going to go for it anyway, even if this adult authority figure thinks this is not appropriate. So she applies to Princeton, and she gets into Princeton, and then there she is. She's going to an Ivy League school for her university education. So again, when Michelle goes to Princeton, she's got a little bit of that am I good enough thing happening again. It's pretty intimidating. There are not that many women at Princeton at this point. It's still solidly a guy's school. There were less than 9% black students at Princeton, so she's looking around and she's one of the few African Americans that's there. And maybe just like she felt like she had to prove herself at Whitney Young High School because she was kind of representing her whole poor neighborhood, now she feels like, whoa, I've kind of got to represent my whole race here because I'm definitely a minority here. And that had not been so much the case. She'd had a good cohort of fellow black students at Whitney Young. So this was a new thing for her. And you know, she suffered from racial prejudice there. She got assigned to a dorm there, and there were 3 girls that were roommates together. The other 2 girls were white. And there was one girl, Kathy, who she was super nice to Michelle. But sort of halfway through the semester, she got moved into a single room. And Michelle never quite understood why that happened, but she didn't question it. She found out later that Kathy's mom had been very upset that her daughter had a black roommate. And she just insisted to Princeton that they had to get her daughter a different room so she didn't have a black roommate. And so there was this subliminal, I mean, it wasn't like super overt, but whoa, some very serious and ugly racial prejudice that Michelle Obama is being a victim of here. But she does very, very well academically at Princeton. And then she's building her confidence, decides to go to law school. She applies to the very best law schools. I mean, she's coming from a really good undergraduate background, so she can kind of take her pick of law schools, and ends up going to Harvard Law School, which is like the best. So at Harvard Law School, again, she does extraordinarily well and graduates, you know, with high standing. And then she's, you know, she's in a good position to get a really great position with a law firm. And in this case, she decided to go with a Chicago law firm. She wanted to go back to Chicago. And she went with one of the very, very best law firms, this firm, Sidley and Austin. And that's a very Tony law firm, offices in many cities, but a very large office in Chicago, right downtown. Oh my God, she's worked. Those places she saw when she drove in on the bus and she saw those people in their suits and those high-rise office buildings. Now that's where she works. And she's got her own private office. She's got a view of the lake. She's got an assistant that's just assigned to her. She's 25 years old. She is working in this very Tony environment. She goes to step aerobics after work every day. She gets a wine subscription. Because she can, she buys herself a Saab. She's living the life. She is really, really successful. And I think this is critical in thinking now, what were the values that she was embedded with as a kid? What is success? How do you get there? She did everything right. She got to this point, she got this great job, and she's on her way. But there's still something just nagging at Michelle. Are these really my values? Is this really what I want to do with my life? And she's a very introspective person. And so in the next talk, we're gonna see what she does with this. Where does she dig a little deeper into her values and reorient what she really wants to do? Okay, think about this. See you next time.